Okay.
Okay,
So-
but where are we now?
We're
10?
at 10B5,
Yeah.
the right-hand column toward the top, 2, 4, 5, 5 lines down. There's a space, and that's where we're starting.
Reb Abba Bar
Right.
Kahana.
Rabbi Abba Bar Kahana. Okay, so again, what we're doing is we're going through a lot of different variations. Different rabbis chose different ways to start their midrash, their public expounding of lessons to be learned from the Megillah. So we're still at the openings, right? That's what we have here. Patach la pitcha. He opened the translation. He introduced his lecture. He opened up with an opening, right? That's the literal Aramaic translation here. So we've done a whole bunch of them already. And one of the things that we notice is this was a very popular material for making sermons and teachings, right? And they're all preserved here. Everybody's jumping onto the bandwagon of talking about the Megillah. So now we have this sage, and let's see what he does with it. Who's going to read? Going once, going twice. Come
Fine.
on. Josie's going to read.
Oh, excellent.
Rabbi Abba Bar Kahana introduced his lecture on this scriptural portion, the book of Esther, with an exposition on the following verse. To a man who pleases him, he has given wisdom, knowledge, and joy.
Okay, note 77.
Ecclesiastes chapter 2, verse 26.
Right. So again, just to point out the what we know already, he's going far afield, right? In order to begin talking about the Megillah, he chooses a verse from an entirely different book of the Tanakh, of the Bible, right? So he picks something from Ecclesiastes. Okay, so to a man who pleases him, meaning God has given wisdom, knowledge, and joy. So the person does good things that make God happy, and then God gives as reward and as a gift back, gives to that person wisdom, knowledge, and joy. Go ahead.
This refers to Mordecai the righteous. The verse continues, and to the sinner he has given the urge to gather and amass. This refers to Haman. The verse continues, that he, the sinner, may pass it on to one who is pleasing to God. This refers to Mordecai and Esther. And it is written, and Esther put Mordecai in charge of Haman's estate. The wealth that Haman amassed was passed on to Mordecai.
Okay, so how do we see here? We were just talking a couple of minutes ago in Pirkei Avot about the kind of karma that gets worked out in life. And here we have this sage explaining how God deals with the righteous and the wicked. So the first thing, the person who is righteous, who makes God happy by following God's ways, what do they benefit? What's their benefit?
They get wisdom, knowledge, and joy.
Right.
That's pretty
So they
good.
get all of these spiritual, abstract kinds of gifts, right? Then we have the wicked. So we would expect the wicked should get misery and ignorance, and should be the flip side, right? But instead, what does he say? To the sinner, God has given a gift, not a punishment, but a gift. What's the gift?
Stuff.
An
Success.
entrepreneurial drive, right? Initiative to gather and amass. The wicked person is going to really, really succeed, and have, tremendous assets accumulate through their efforts. So that should make us a little uncomfortable, right? This is the famous question, why do the wicked prosper? What's the answer? The rest of the verse tells us, so that the sinner may pass it on to the one who is pleasing to God. And in the end, the sinner is actually just doing this without knowing, is doing this on behalf of the righteous. All of this amassing of wealth eventually will come into the hands of the righteous. But the righteous won't have to knock themselves out. The righteous won't have to sit through all the negotiations of the hostile takeover and this and that and the other thing. The righteous are going to go and do all the good stuff that is part of what makes God happy with them. And then the wealth afterwards will fall into their laps. The hard work that the wicked expend in pursuing purely material goals, that the righteous person is saved from. But the result will be that they actually get it. What's the best example? The best example is Haman, right? Haman reached the very apogee of power in except for being the king himself. We'll get to that being pointed out later. But he has tremendous success, and all of that success in the end goes to Mordechai and Esther, right? So that's the ironic comeuppance that we have. Okay. Any comments? Moving right along. Rabbi
Bar Ofran introduced his lecture on this scriptural portion, the book of Esther, with an exposition on the following verse. And I will set my throne in Elam and will destroy from there king and princes. King, this refers to Vashti, and princes, this refers to Haman and his 10 sons.
Okay. So a verse, as it says in the notes from Jeremiah, that prophesies that God will eventually, I'll establish my throne. Not the people who think that they're going to be ruling and controlling Elam. And Elam here is understood to be Persia. And then I will destroy the king and princes. So why doesn't Rabba, what is it? Rabba Bar Ofran. Why doesn't Rabba Bar Ofran say king means the king?
Because he wants to tie it to the Purim story.
And so why can't we say the king in the Purim story? Because Achashverosh doesn't get destroyed, right? Achashverosh continues to be the king. Achashverosh, we're going to see this a little bit as we go forward. Achashverosh is a funny kind of character, right? How do we actually view Achashverosh? This is more of a Purim discussion than now, but Haman is the famous evil one, right? In this particular teaching, apparently Vashti is also seen as an evil person. But where's Achashverosh in our, white hats and black hats? Right?
He's sort of weak and
Bumbling.
inept and naive, I guess. Or
So that's what we sort of say, right? That's the way we've sort of pegged him, as this kind of like, he's not really the sharpest guy. He's easily swayed by whoever it is that's giving him advice at the moment. If it's Haman, he'll say, okay, yeah, that sounds great. Let's do whatever Haman says. If it's Esther or Mordechai, then yeah, let's do whatever they say. Maybe, but again, we're not going to spend too much time right now. But next Purim, before we get to Purim, what is that? Does that have any moral, does that have any moral resonance? It's hard to believe, although maybe not that hard, but he's the king. Is he a complete dodo? Is he just, I mean, we're not talking about the Dauphin or something. We're not talking about some 8-year-old, kid that was put on the throne, who's just manipulated by their advisors. And the manipulation by advisors is definitely a historical reality in a lot of royal situations. But just in general, I'm just putting it out there that he's a more mysterious, quantity. If we think about the ethics of what's going on, Vashti now here is therefore the person who has to be identified as king, right? Ruler. Even though king in Hebrew, melech, is male, but here she's the queen, and she is the one who was deposed, right? So that's the fulfillment of the verse. So she got deposed because that's not what God wanted. So does that, we these days celebrate Vashti. She's like a feminist icon.
Yeah.
She's a strong person who sticks up for herself, so to speak. But does that mean that she's a tzaddikas? Does that mean that she's really a righteous heroine? Yeah, Jen, you wanted to say something.
Well, why does God want Vashti not to be deposed? Did he not want to raise Esther up to the throne?
Right. So that's part of the story, obviously, and we're not going to get Esther unless we get Vashti out of the way. So let's really think about alternative universes. You do this all the time, right? Can you imagine, why can't Vashti be like Pharaoh's daughter?
Oh, brave.
Why can't the redemption of the Jewish people come from Vashti?
No.
Do we really need Esther to take Vashti's place so that the Jewish people can be saved? So maybe that's one way of thinking about, hey, there's something missing in Vashti. Vashti wasn't going to do that. I'm going to bring up a very, very, very contemporary example of a person, a strong woman who stood up for what's right. And nevertheless, in my eyes, has a lot to answer for. Liz Cheney, right? Here's a person who actually drew the red line, and said, no, I'm not going to say that embarrassment of a human being, is always right. And what he says about the election is a terrible lie, and we should never, never, ever support that kind of lying. So that was heroic, and she paid for it. She got deposed. But if you look at her political record until then, she voted for everything that Trump wanted all down the line. So, does that, the fact that she stood up against the electoral lie, does that make her, redeemed and now she's a hero for everybody? So it's complicated.
Still, you could argue though that if it were Vashti, she wouldn't have the personal connection if she went to the king and said, "Don't do this to the Jews," she wouldn't have the ability to say that includes me. I mean, there's other things where she might not have been effective even if she had good intentions.
Correct. Yeah, that's why we would have to build an entirely alternative universe with different factors, playing into it. With the Esther, figure, it has that poignancy of playing on Achashverosh's heartstrings, and that, of course, brings back to that whole complexity about Achashverosh himself. What kind of heart does he actually have? All good questions to think about. So anyway, the point is that this little introduction gives us some some nuanced issues to consider, right? And then the princes, that's Haman and his 10 sons. That's an easier application. Okay, next.
Bill may have to take over because I'm not sure I have the next page.
If you have 10, you have 11.
I don't know, it's not marked right. Well, anyhow, Rob Dimi Bar Yitzhak introduced his lecture on this scriptural portion with an exposition on the following verse.
Oh my God, now what are we gonna do? Well, it's a cliffhanger. It's a cliffhanger.
Yeah, okay, Bill, will you take over? Because I'm not sure I have the right page.
Okay, I forwarded all the stuff to you. You asked me for it, and I forwarded all. Depends on how you printed it out. So,
Yeah.
but you should have it somewhere there. But be that as it
This
may.
where we are
Right.
slaves?
No.
Ah, I see.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, we are slaves. 11A1.
This is 11A1, okay. For we are slaves, but in our servitude our God has not forsaken us. He has directed the goodwill of the Persian kings toward us. When did
Okay,
God...
where is this from? Where is this from? Look at in footnote number 1.
Ezra, chapter 9, verse 9.
Keep going.
When did God do this for us?
No, keep going in the note.
This verse, the verse continues to grant us life. From
Okay, so
these
let's read the whole verse. We are slaves, but in our servitude our God has not forsaken us. God has directed the goodwill of the Persian kings toward us to grant us life. Okay, that's the verse.
Okay.
Okay, so now go ahead.
From these words, it is evident that the verse refers to the time of Haman. Haman had planned to kill every Jew, and thus God, by saving us from Haman's murderous designs, granted us life.
Right. So that's the application of a kind of a vague verse to the specifics of the Purim story. I just want to point out context. Ezra, the book of Ezra and the book of Nehemiah, often seen as one book. They were contemporaries. They worked together. When are they? Just in general, you don't have to remember the exact date on the calendar.
After this, right? They're the return. They're the exiles who get to return.
Right. This is the beginning of the Second Commonwealth, the beginning of the Second Temple period. They are the leaders. Nehemiah is the political communal leader, and Ezra is the spiritual communal leader of the returnees who come back from Babylonia to the land of Israel, to Judea, to start up again a Jewish commonwealth, a Jewish homeland. This is done at the permission of Cyrus, the king or the emperor of Persia. Achashverosh is also an emperor of Persia, right? So putting these that context together, the Purim story is located in that area, that period between the exile. It's mentioned in the book of Esther that Mordechai was one of the leaders of the Jewish people who was exiled when the first temple was destroyed. He's a local leader, therefore, in Persia. Ezra and Nehemiah leave Persia and go to the land of Israel. It's a whole, interesting question. So did Mordechai ever, make aliyah, so to speak? Did he ever, in the end, leave his privileged position? It doesn't say that. He becomes, like the Henry Kissinger of Persia. So,
So I just have one quick.
interesting background. So, but that story of Purim is located in that in-between state of a big Jewish diaspora with the fledgling beginnings of a new Jewish state. Yeah.
Sorry, so not all the Jews went to Babylonia. They went to
They
the
did go to
Maghreb?
Babylonia, but Babylonia was then overtaken by Persia.
Oh, I see. Oh,
It was
so by the
conquered
time
without-
Cyrus was, the ruler, it was Persian.
Right.
Okay,
Persia was the empire,
right,
right?
but they were more tolerant of the Jews, or more.
Right. They had a whole different way of doing empire.
Okay.
The Babylonians were, slash and burn, right? And, just subdue everybody. And the Persians were much more benign. Let's just get the money from these different groups, let the groups, live as best as they can, let them
Okay.
take care of themselves. And that, for us, that was like a big deal, because that meant that, explicitly, Cyrus says, go back home. That's what's going to make you happy, for sure. As long as I get my tribute, I don't care. Okay, so back to the 11A1. When did God do this? Right, that's what we're up to.
When did God do this for us? In the time of Haman.
Okay.
Rav
Next.
Hani Bar Papa introduced his lecture on this scriptural portion with an exposition on the following verse. You mounted a mortal over our heads. We entered fire and water.
Okay, from Psalms. Okay, and now he breaks it down.
We entered fire in the days of the wicked Nebuchadnezzar, and water in the days of Pharaoh. And you brought us out into abundance in the days of Haman.
Okay, so the way that he sees this is that the verse in Psalms, which celebrates God's redeeming power, goes a little bit backwards. First, it mentions Nebuchadnezzar. That's the days when we talk about fire. You mounted a mortal over our heads. We entered fire and water. So the fire, remember that we have the stories of Daniel in the lion's den, and we have Abraham in the fiery furnace. All of these kinds of images of people who are willing to martyr themselves in order to stay loyal to God. If you look at note 3,
Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, cast
Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah
into a blazing furnace for not bowing down to a graven image. According to Maharasha, the Gemara refers to Nebuchadnezzar's burning of the first temple.
Right. So Maharsha
Fire.
says that the fire refers to burning down the temple, but it says we entered the fire. So I think that the first explanation is better. We had to walk into the fire for your sake, right? And we walked into the water. What was that all about? That was the days of Pharaoh, going backwards, right? When the splitting of the Red Sea, the Red Sea didn't split until we actually walked into the water up to our necks, and then the water split. So we showed how much we are devoted to you, God, in those different days. And then it says, and you brought us out, vatotzienu lirvaya. You brought us out for, here the translation is into abundance. The word revaya is a word that we have in Psalm 23, right? We say kosi revaya. My cup, what? Overflows. So another translation would be much more watery oriented, or even wine oriented, and said, you took us out to experience the overflowingness of a cup. So some people say that's why it's Purim, right? Because Purim is when we really have a great time, drinking l'chaim for everybody. But of course, where did that come from? That because that's the opening scene of the book of Esther. The opening scene of the book of Esther is everybody's having a party. Everybody can drink as much as they want, right? So that's what it starts with. It starts with that party, which ends up becoming, of course, the downfall of Vashti and sets the ball rolling. Then we've got parties in the middle of the story again and again. And finally, when we're redeemed and saved, we celebrate by saying, you know what, we should have a party, right? So that's the Revaya, that's the overflowing. Okay. Rabbi Yochanan.
Rabbi Yochanan introduced his lecture on the scriptural portion, the book of Esther, with an exposition on the following verse. He recalled his kindness and faithful pledge to the house of Israel. All ends of the earth have seen the salvation of our God.
Bye-bye. Jen just left. Okay.
From Psalms.
Okay, so this is from Psalms. We recite this Psalm every Friday night. Go ahead.
When did all ends of the earth see the salvation of our God? In the days of Mordecai and Esther, when letters proclaiming the victory of the Jews were sent throughout the world.
Right. So this is part of the story. We start introducing Achashverosh as an emperor who has how many provinces or how many nations are under his control?
A lot, but I don't remember the number.
127. 127 kingdoms are under his control. So therefore, when we finally get to the end, the Jews are all over the place, right? That's part of the Babylonian, repercussions. The diaspora of the Jewish people has been created by the Babylonians, and we are spread far and wide. So when we have this local redemption in close to Persia, Shushan, and so on, what is Mordecai and Esther, what do they have to do? They have to send letters throughout the empire. First of all, to tell everybody to defend themselves. And second of all, that when they're victorious, to say, okay, and now we're sending out a letter all over to tell you, please, we're all now going to, as one, celebrate Purim, right? All at the same time. So that's the whole world, right? It happened not in some backwater someplace where just a few people would know about it. It happened, in a world empire situation. So everybody saw God's salvation. Okay, good. Moving right along. We're doing great. We're going to finish this whole page.
Reish Lakish, isn't he the bad guy who turned serious?
Yes, good for you. You remember, he was a brigand. He was a highway robber. And then he got influenced by Rabbi Yochanan, who just taught the previous paragraph, right? And he became Rabbi Yochanan's student, and then his, co-equal. And he would always argue with Rabbi Yochanan. So now we have his approach.
Okay. Reish Lakish introduced his lecture on this scriptural portion, the book of Esther, with an exposition on the following verse. As a roaring lion and a growling bear, so is a wicked ruler over a poor nation.
Okay, and this comes from Proverbs.
Proverbs 28. Okay. This verse is interpreted phrase by phrase. A roaring lion refers to the wicked Nebuchadnezzar, of whom it is written, the lion arose from his thicket. A growling bear, this refers to
Achashverosh,
of whom it is written, and behold, another beast, the top line is a second one, similar to a bear. And Rav Yosef has taught the following, but right there. This
okay, wait a half a second. So the verse says that a bad ruler is like a wild beast, right? And we have these different comparisons that we have. And so wild beasts, you can't trust them. They're destructive. They just do whatever they want to do and trample anybody else that gets in their way. So that's what a bad ruler is. Okay, over a poor nation, right? Nebuch Too many times, nations that are struggling end up getting manipulated and what's the word I'm looking for? They get taken advantage of by some dictator, by some ruler who sucks them dry. That's the lament of this verse. But now we take it and we apply it to our own experience. The poor nation now is the people of Israel. And the first one is Nebuchadnezzar. That's the Babylonian emperor who destroyed our temple and exiled us. And he was referred to by Jeremiah, who lived at the destruction of the first temple. He was compared to a lion. So he's the lion. And then we have the bear. This is Achashverosh. And we have there a quote from the book of Daniel, right? Yes, from the book of Daniel, that the second one, meaning the second empire, Daniel has this vision, this political vision of various empires that come and go until finally the redemption is brought by the messianic figure that he imagines. So the second empire, the first empire is Babylonia, the second empire is Persia. So that's the bear. Okay, so that's the application to the bear. Okay, so now
But
we have
here, Rabbi,
can't hear you. You just became muted. You're muted. You're muted. You're muted.
Josie, we can't hear you.
She's not on mute. We just lost her audio.
Go look for your audio. Maybe it's on the floor or someplace.
now, and every once in a while, despite all the changes they made, I still fade out. I was going to say, here, Ahasuerus is not known just as naive and maybe simple, but he's mean, he's bad.
Well, if Esther hadn't and Mordecai hadn't saved the day,
He would have
Ahasuerus would be the state sponsor of a genocide.
Right.
So, how innocuous is that?
Yeah. So this is much stronger. Okay.
Okay.
And behold,
Okay, so now we're at 11a, and Rav Yosef is going to do a little more of applications about lions and bears and stuff to the people that we just applied it to.
Rav Yosef has taught the following Baraita. This refers to the Persians who eat and drink like a bear.
Okay, so not just Ahasuerus himself, all the Persians are like a bear, right? So he has here a kind of a, he's culturally stereotyping these people and saying, they're just completely gluttonous and drinking all the time. Go ahead.
And are covered with flesh like a bear.
Right, they're big, heavy
and fat,
people. Go ahead.
And grow hair like a bear. And like a bear are never at rest.
Right, so obviously he doesn't know about the hibernating part of the bears, but when they're not hibernating, they're moving around constantly looking for food, right? That's all they do. They just constantly keep on going, prowling around, trying to find anything that they can eat. So he says that's the Persian people, right? Obviously not a big admirer of the Persian people.
A wicked ruler. This refers to Haman over a poor nation. This refers to the Jews who were poor in their observance of the divine commandments.
So first of all, let's notice that he switches off from Ahasuerus over to Haman. So here we go again, right? What do we do with this Ahasuerus guy? How much do we want to go, negative on him? So here, this sage says, I'm not interested in Ahasuerus. I'm going to condemn Haman more than I am going to condemn Ahasuerus. And he's the power behind the throne. So I'm not interested in just talking about the puppet that's sitting on the throne. It's Haman who is driving the agenda. So he's the terrible, evil ruler. And then when he says the poor people, how does he interpret that?
He interprets it not that we didn't have possessions and land, but that we didn't observe the commandments.
Right. He says the
That's-
poverty that the Jewish people were experiencing was a spiritual poverty. They did great. They were very successful. They were, we have this discussion now all the time about American Jewry, right? In many ways, we not in this is not to be qualified. It's just absolutely the case that we are the most successful, materially and politically, most successful Jewish community that has ever existed, ever. Hold on a second. Talk to you later. So, but our what's not, and that's totally clear. What's not clear, two things are not clear. First of all, our future is not clear. Are we going to maintain our political influence and success? Are we going to maintain our educational exceptionalism? Are we going to, maintain our material success? But more, questionable and more of a subject of a lot of back and forth and head scratching is, are we going to endure as a people that has a culture, religious or not, that sustains us and with which we identify? There was just, some people may have seen this. There was the Pew study, PEW, right? The Pew study, which is considered like the latest, most accurate representation of what's going on in American Jewry. And there's endless discussion about the sociological takeaways of the data, but you have, some very serious kinds of indications that, people say, I'm Jewish, they're called the nuns. I'm Jewish, but I'm not, I'm not interested in religion. I don't believe in God. I don't really care about Israel that much. But I'm proud to be Jewish. I'm Jewish. And some people say, look at that, we're still Jewish. We still have plenty of people who are Jewish. And then other people say, well, what is it? So what's going to happen? So I'm not a prophet, and nobody can predict what's going on, what's going to happen in the future. What did Mordechai say to Esther? Look, you're here for a reason. But he said, if you don't step up to save the Jewish people, which is what you were placed in your position to do, you will fail. This will be your own personal failure of your destiny. But you know what? But relief and salvation will come to the Jewish people from some other place. The Jewish people will endure. The Jewish people will survive. The only question is, are you going to take part in that? Are you going to be actively engaged in that? Or no, it'll be up to somebody else, some other place where Judaism will flourish. And in your place, it won't. So here we're touching on that kind of ongoing discussion that has never stopped within our collective consciousness, our own, asking ourselves these kinds of questions. So this sage is, making a little bit of an admonition that if, and from the definition that he has, right? If we don't keep the Torah, then we are an impoverished people. No matter how well we do, in the stock market or professionally or in any other way. Okay. Yeah, anybody want to make a comment? Every time we have one of these little breaks, that's for comments. Okay, and we keep going. Rabbi Elazar.
Rabbi Elazar introduced his lecture on this scriptural portion, the book of Esther, with an exposition on the following verse. Through laziness, the ceiling collapses, and through idleness of the hands, the house leaks.
Okay, so and this is again from Ecclesiastes, from Kohelet. Okay, how does this going to work out? Let's see.
The first phrase is interpreted homiletically. Because of the laziness of the Jews who did not engage in the study of Torah, the enemy of the Holy One, blessed is he, became poor.
Okay, so now we have to understand how he's speaking.
Hmm.
We have a similar idea of impoverishment having to do with not following the Torah, except that he's switching things around a little bit. The enemy of the Holy One, blessed is he, the Holy Blessed One. The enemy of the Holy Blessed One is his way of saying God. But he doesn't want to say God. He's speaking euphemistically.
Ah.
So when we say something bad happens, for instance, a lot of times we say, oh, if the Jewish people don't keep the Torah, then the enemies of the Jewish people will fall. We really mean the Jewish people will fall. But we don't want to say the Jewish people will fall. It's a terrible thing to say. So therefore we turn it backwards and we say, Sonei Shel Yisrael, when we really mean Yisrael. The enemies of the Jewish people, we're really talking about the Jewish people. But we don't want to say bad about us, so we say bad about them. So here, he's saying something very radical theologically. He's saying not just we're an impoverished people. He's saying if we don't keep the Torah, God is an impoverished God. So he says the enemy of God becomes poor, but he doesn't, because he doesn't want to say what I'm saying, right? He's guarding his tongue from saying something like that, God forbid. But really that's what he's trying to say, and everybody understands this. What he's saying is how horrible, I can't even say these words, but look what, if we don't do this, it's not just on us. Personal choice. It's my business whether I want to be a good Jew or not. Right? What he says is, it's not just a personal choice. It actually impacts God. Okay? This is not exactly one of those pure philosophical Maimonidean ideas of God. God is perfect. God can't be touched. God is always, all powerful, all knowing, all present, etc. This is much more of the kind of idea that we have, for instance, when we study the Zohar, that God's presence in the world, I'm trying to even make it, easier to understand as I speak, is diminished when we actively, humanly don't make God's presence strong. So if we're not going to advance a godly consciousness in the world, then God can be as great as God is up in the heavens above, but God is really not going to be significant. The power of God is totally diminished by our neglect.
Hmm.
And there's implications for this beyond that. If we corrupt the Torah, if we, in the name of the Torah, advance an agenda that is one of cruelty, of insensitivity, of selfishness, of immorality, then we are corrupting, ruining God, right? So this is, in a certain sense, God is really hostage to us, right? God's greatness, God is great, but God is only great depending on how we make God great. Where do we have a prayer where we call upon ourselves to make God great? The answer is that's what the Kaddish is. Yitkadal v'yitkadash shmei Rabbah. Magnified and sanctified be God's holy name. right? God's name means God's presence, the consciousness of God, the awareness of God in the world, the manifestation of God's presence in the world. And we say, may God's presence be augmented, be enlarged. How? By us. One person says the Kaddish and calls out to the rest of the community. That's why you need a community to say Kaddish. God's presence in the world depends on communities gathering together. And one person says to everybody else, are you all with me? Can we all do this together? And the answer is, Amen. Yehei, Shmei, Rabba. Yes, we're all with you. We are all committed to this. And when do we do this? We do this every day that we can collect a minyan together. And we also say it when a person dies, because one of the troops to augment God's name has fallen, right? So we carry God's name with us. Each and every one of us is created in God's image. When one of us dies, a piece of God has died. And how do we fight back against that? We say the Kaddish. No, let's all add extra energy. Let's all add extra commitment to make God's name greater, despite the fact that we've suffered a loss. So this is, in a much more, God-centered perspective. The previous one, the poverty is ours. We don't follow the traditions, so that's our loss.
But it's God.
Now this rabbi is saying it's worse than that, right? It's God's loss. Okay, and now we have just a beefing up of that interpretation by showing how it's apparent from other verses as well. This interpretation. See where we are? Josie, you got it?
Yeah, it's the fading in and out. Okay. This interpretation is implicit in the words of the verse. The word
Mach. That's the word that's in that verse.
certainly means poor. And as it is said, and if he is too poor for the assessment. And the next word certainly means God.
Right, mekareh. Mekareh means the one who sets the beams.
As it is said in reference to God, who roofs his upper chambers with water.
Okay, so that's using other related verses that have the same terms used in it. And therefore, these terms clearly mean what they were explained by the sage before. Okay, good.
Okay. Rav Nachman Bar Yitzhak introduced his lecture on this scriptural portion, the book of Esther, with an exposition on the following verse. A song of ascents. Had not Hashem been with us, let Israel declare it now. Had not Hashem been with us when a man rose up against us. The verse specifies a man who rose up against us and not a king. This implies a reference to Haman.
Right. So what's the rest of the verse though? Look at 18.
Psalms 124. The psalm continues, then they would have swallowed us alive when their anger was kindled against us.
Right. If it had not been, right, had not God been with us, right, and this is serious, everybody, let's say amen, yes. If not God, had God not had, so this is like a psalm that shows you that we're talking about call and response here, right? Within the text of the psalm, we see that this is like a preacher or a chazan calling out, and everybody's supposed to, like in a Baptist church, go, oh yeah, right? So that's the verse, right? A song of ascents. Had not Hashem been with us, let Israel declare it now. Yes, amen. Had not Hashem been with us, a man rose up against us and would have swallowed us alive. So who is that man? So as the explanation is, it doesn't say a king, it says a man. And therefore it's, again, we're taking Achashverosh off the hook. and we're again focusing on Haman. Okay, so if not for God, Haman would have, completely destroyed us. Now, of course, that's our religious interpretation in the book of Psalms and through the sages. And as always, we remember that the book of Esther doesn't mention God at all, right? But we're saying if it wasn't for God, it doesn't say if it wasn't for Mordechai and Esther, Haman would have destroyed us. No, we give credit to God. Okay.
People rejoice, but when the wicked rule, the people sigh. Each phrase of this verse is interpreted. When the righteous are exalted, the people rejoice. This refers to Mordechai and Esther, as it is written, and the city of Shushan was cheerful and glad when Mordecai appeared dressed in the royal attire.
Right, so that verse is afterwards when things are going well, after Haman, sort of like the tide has turned. So it says there that the city of Shushan was full of rejoicing. Haman is leading Mordechai on the king's horse, and Mordechai is dressed up, with the king's garments, and everybody's very happy except for Haman. But there's another verse, as we're going to see in a second, that came earlier. Go ahead.
But when the wicked rule, the people sigh. This refers to Haman, as it is written, but the city of Shushan was bewildered after Haman issued his decree to annihilate the Jews.
Right. So the word in Hebrew is navocha. Navocha means perplexed or confused. Mora nevuchim, the guide for the perplexed, but it also has within it the echo of crying, right? Of boche. So that was when Mordechai and Esther decree that the Jewish people should fast because Haman has made this plan to get rid of them. So this is the earlier verse. And the city is in shambles and everybody's upset. And then the second verse comes later. I mean, the verse that we just quoted first, that's the verse that talks about the same city rejoicing, right? This is one of the motifs in the Purim story of reversals, right? Something is one way, and then afterwards it gets turned upside down. So the city that's sad is turned upside down and becomes the city that rejoices. Why? Well, the wicked bring terrible lament and confusion, and the righteous bring joy and happiness. Okay.
Rav Maznar introduced his lecture on Esther with an exposition on the following verse. For what nation is so great that has God close to it? Rav Ashi introduced his lecture on Esther with an exposition on the following verse. Or has any God done miracles, etc.
Okay, so we can look at the notes for the continuations of these verses, and if you look at 24 is a nice big long note, and 25 is a nice big long note. Why? Because in the Talmud there's nothing there, right? In the Talmud it simply reports Rav Masna introduced his lecture with this verse, but it doesn't tell us why. Why is this verse so? It doesn't give us the rest of his artistry. How did he connect up that verse with the Purim story? And before that, we had some verse and we said, look, this part of the verse refers to Haman. This part of the verse refers to Mordechai and Esther. This part of the verse refers to Ahashverosh, etc., 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 right? But here we don't have an unpacking of the verse. We just have a citation of the verse. So let's look at 24.
Haman told Ahasuerus that God had rejected the Jews and had driven them far away from his presence. He said, there is a certain people scattered and dispersed among the nations in all the provinces of your realm. The verse quoted by Rav Masna demonstrates the fallacy of Haman's assertion. God is close to the Jewish nation in every place that we cry out to him.
All right, that's the rest of the phrase. Go ahead.
Wherever the Jews find themselves, they are close to God. They were never driven away from him, for his presence fills the entire world. Rambam writes, the sages ordained that the Megillah be read in its designated time in order to bless God and praise him, and in order to inform future generations of the truth of what he promised us in the Torah. For what nation is so great that has God close to it as Hashem, our God, is whenever we cry out to him? You want to read all the rest? Yad?
See Maharal, go ahead.
Conclusion of the enumeration of the mitzvot. See Maharal, who writes that the Jews were saved from Haman through the efficacy of their prayers.
Right. Remember when Mordechai and Esther decree 3 days of fasting and prayer? So that's where God answers our prayers and saves us. But I want to come back to the main point here, which is, as I said a second ago, what Rav Masna is really saying is that the only way we can look through at this story of the Megillah is by starting with the lens of God's presence as being close to us. Otherwise, the story is just the story of coincidences and happenstance and, close calls and whatever. No, unless we remember this verse, that who can imagine how close God is? Wow, God is so close to us no matter where we are, no matter what it is that we need, God will listen to us and come to our aid. That's the beginning of our perspective of how we're supposed to read the rest of the book. So that's his opening. Okay, so it's almost like obvious. The Talmud doesn't even have to spell it out. So that's that one. Then we have the next one. The next one, Rav Ashi, right? He says that there's another verse that really we need to use as our kind of guiding principle, right? And this is also from Deuteronomy, right? And let's look at what the verse says. Note 25.
Okay, 25. The verse discusses the redemption from Egypt. Its entire text reads, it's a lot of Hebrew here. Or has any God done miracles to go and take him a nation from the midst of another nation by trials, by signs, and by wonders, and by war, and by a strong hand, and by an outstretched arm, and by a great dread, like all that Hashem your God did for you in Egypt before your eyes?
Right, so that's the full verse. Moses, this is at the beginning of Deuteronomy. Moses is trying to, again, this is his last speech, and he's trying to impress upon the Israelites how unbelievable, how amazing, how extraordinary their history, their short history has been, and how much God has done for them. And he says, just think about it. In world history, has this ever happened before? Has any other national God, G-O-D, extricated a people from under the oppression and the subjugation of another people and raised them up to be free and able to be part of a partnership with God? Has that ever happened before except now with you? Look at how unique this is. So that's Moses' point. I want to just also point out that the word that is translated here, for what nation, where is it? Or has any God done miracles, etc. That's their translation. Or has any God done miracles to go and take, what does it say there? Take him a nation. Take him a nation, right? So has that ever happened? The Hebrew is O Hanisa Elohim lavo lakachat lo goy mikerev goy. So the word Hanisa here is translated as coming from the word miracle, nes, but you could translate it differently. And that is, has any God ever tried, attempted, right? From the word linasot, nisayon, Has any God ever tried to do this? And remember, when God tries to do this, it takes a lot of effort on God's part before God succeeds. First of all, we don't make it easy for God. Moses, we talked about this earlier in the morning. Moses gives God a tremendous argument before Moses finally agrees to be the leader of the Jewish people, to take them out of Egypt. He doesn't want to do it. And God has to argue with him and argue and argue. And then, of course, look at how much God has to do before Pharaoh says yes. So another way to translate this is not, or has any God done miracles, but has any God ever tried, attempted to do this? You think this is easy? And yet look at what happened. God actually succeeded in taking us out, extricating one people out of the control, out of the grasp, out of the tight grip of another people. That only happened between us and God. So that the literal verse is talking about Pharaoh. Okay, but now what does Rav Ashi say? He says we need to think about that verse not in relation to Pharaoh, but in relation to the Purim story. Okay, so let's look at the rest now of this note.
You want to
Rav
read
Ashi
the rest?
in the second paragraph in note 25.
Rav Ashi notes a common factor between the redemption from Haman and the redemption from Egypt. A distinguishing characteristic of the Egyptian redemption was that it came about by the very means that the Egyptians had sought to employ against the Jews. The Egyptians had attempted to annihilate the Jews by casting all Jewish male babies into the river Nile, and they themselves were destroyed by drowning in the Red Sea. A similar phenomena is manifest in the Purim story. On the very day that Haman had designated for the destruction of the Jews, the opposite took place, and the Jews were successful in attacking and destroying their enemies. The words of the verse, literally, a nation from the midst of a nation, are interpreted a nation in place of a nation. That is, the Egyptians were put in the place of the Jews whom they had sought to harm.
So this is Maharsha's interpretation. But there's other possible interpretations, obviously. Geraldine, you wanted to say something?
Well, that's a little bit what we talked about in Pirkei Avot with the
What?
skull, with the skull and that if you know if you were the skull was there because you behaved negatively.
Right, not just negatively, but the very, very same thing that you did to somebody else will then be done to you, and so on and so forth. Right.
Right.
So yeah, but that's what Maharsha is saying. I think that if we take the words actually at face value, the verse says literally, God took us out of a different people. Goy mikerev goy, literally as it says here. How do they translate it? A nation from the midst of a nation. Right? Has any God ever attempted, or has any God ever miraculously extricated one nation from out of another nation? Well, that's the Exodus story, right? We were actually able to leave, to Exodus. If we take that literally, does that apply to the Purim story?
But we stayed in Persia, didn't we?
So we didn't have an exodus from Persia, right? As nice as the story is about Ezra and Nehemiah restoring the Second Commonwealth, that was a minute minority of the Jewish people that came back to the land of Israel. So it's not a big exodus story, unless that's what you want to focus on. The Persians let us go back to the land of Israel. But it pales in comparison to the Pharaoh story. But I would suggest that you have something else going on here. Again, comparisons don't always work out so perfectly, but nevertheless, and that is, what is Esther's drama? How does Esther's experience in Persia, and specifically, of course, she gets chosen to be the queen. How does her experience develop in our story of the book of Esther? How does she start and where does she end up?
Oh,
So one thing, of course, is she starts as just a run-of-the-mill, maiden someplace, and she ends up being queen of Persia. So that's pretty good. But there's a more fundamental transformation that happens not externally, but internally. Right? The external circumstances, she wins the lottery, right? Purim is about winning the lottery, right? She wins the lottery, so she's the queen, she wins the contest. But what happens inside her?
she realizes she's got an important role to play in Jewish history. It's not
Right.
just about her.
She starts out not telling anybody that she's Jewish. She tells nobody what her true identity is. And when she becomes the queen, again, the page 6, wow, first Jewish queen of Persia, none of that is there. Even after she attains that high status, she doesn't fess up to who she is. She doesn't say, hey, I happen to be, of the Jewish people.
Sounds like Moses.
Well, there you go. So the Exodus story is about owning one's own identity, right? And Esther and the Jewish people are challenged in the Purim story to stand up for themselves, in terms of declaring who they are, to stand up for themselves as being proud of who they are, and eventually stand up for themselves even if it means fighting. Haman's accusation against the Jews is the classic anti-Semitic accusation, ancient, and pre-Christian, by the way. Oh, they're clannish, they stick to themselves, they're not really part of the rest of the people. And one of the ways that we fight that kind of anti-Semitism is by saying, no, we really are part of the people. We really are. We're just like you. There's no difference between us and you, which of course is true on a human level, on a biological level, and on a rights level, and on a consciousness level, in terms of just being a human being. That's completely correct. But that's the challenge then. So is assimilation the best answer to anti-Semitism? Many people, many Jews have decided absolutely. That's the right thing. And Purim is about that question. The tradition sees that first scene that I mentioned before, the first party scene, right? As we're in there. Who got invited to the White House? Who got invited to the Christmas party? Who got invited to this? Oh, we've got Jews that are invited to all those things. So that's great. We're in there, having a ball and drinking as much as we want. And look at how great, they love us, they accept us, this is terrific. And then we say, and guess what they're drinking the wine out of? Vessels of all kinds. That's the words. But the way we chant it is we chant it with the Tisha B'Av chanting. You know where they got the vessels to be able to give wine cups to every person so that they could have a wonderful time at Achashverosh's first party? They're drinking out of vessels from the temple, from the destroyed temple, from the looted temple. So this is the way the tradition pictures how we begin our story. And that's pretty, dramatic, and you could go over the top a little bit with this kind of stuff. But we're all, balancing this out. How much do we assert ourselves? How much do we keep ourselves in some kind of unique, way of life that doesn't quite go with what everybody else is doing? And how much do we say no, but it's really important to be, a good citizen and a participant in the world. These are both very important values, and it's not one or the other. It's how do we make it work? How do we make both of them work? And that's the question here too. So the extrication of the Jewish people from out of the Persian people is part of the issue of the Purim story. How much do we stand to the side? How much do we jump in and just mix? Okay, an eternal Jewish question. We're going to stop here. Wait, that was the chat of saying bye-bye. That was from Jennifer. Next week, I'm going to be away. So I wish everybody a happy Memorial Day weekend. And we'll convene the following week, God willing. Okay? And it looks like we're moving very fast here. So I will be sending out pages 12 and 13 of Megillah after I get back. And if you want to really make sure that I send it to you, send me a note, please. Okay? But not now, like in another week. Okay?
Okay.
Thank you.
Yasher koach.